amount of time for questions, comments, general discussion themes that you might want to raise. And I should say, and I forgot to mention this actually in the introductory remarks, a very warm welcome to Hatcham College, sixth form pupils at the back. We're really pleased that you're here and you asked such brilliant questions last time. And you're very welcome to do so again. No pressure. So, questions?
Could you say something about what the political vision of the groups was? I mean, if you look at other, right groups, I mean, for example, UKIP, as far as I can see, has a sort of essentially nostalgic vision of going back to the 1950s, in some sense. The Nazis in Germany have this somewhat contradictory mix of nostalgia, excuse me, for pre-urban, pre-industrial Germany, but then also this huge element of modernism and building industrial infrastructure and the modernism of Europe, their values and so on. So their version of how they imagine the future fascist Germany is a bit more contradictory. So I wondered how the groups you're talking about, did they want to go back before urbanisation and industrialisation to a purely peasant country? How was it going to compete with Western Europe if they did that? How could it take over the areas in the south they'd got off the Ottoman Empire? If it was going to be a Christian Russia when those areas were Muslim and so on. So what was their vision of, what is their kind of fantasy of what Russia would be like?
Yeah, I think fancy is a good word, actually. Yeah. Thanks for that very kind of rich and detailed question. I think to start with, I should say maybe that the lack of a coherent vision is one of the problems of these movements. I think if we're looking longer term, why don't they work? They do. There is a spike in social support after 1905, but they don't win in the end, right? They lose the Revolutionary War. So why is that? And I think part of it is a question of ideology, and it's the lack of a coherent vision, lack of a cohesive vision. Because what you have emerging within these groups is you have a kind of much like Russia itself, it's Janus-headed, right? Neither looking forward, not backward, totally in one direction. So within them, you can point to instances of, say, nostalgia, as you say. Like peasant culture, for example, the idea of peasantry is really strong, and they have like kind of a rural Russia. You can see that kind of plastered all over propaganda at some of the major groups, especially groups like the Union of Russian People that talk about the peasantry. They don't often go into a lot of detail. So giving an idea of what the vision would look like, they're actually not particularly good at that, generally. Within the movement, you can see groups that are slightly more, I think, interesting in terms of how they wish to envisage a future Russia. So some of these groups start to play with ideas of kind of Russian industrial development. I saw evidence in certain archives and certain newspapers I looked at that groups were quite interested in, say, science, for instance, that they saw as potential restorative. In terms of education, some of these groups were quite worried that what they saw as the soft subjects, politics, this is bad anyway, were being pushed too hard in universities, a general suspicion of the arts, and they wanted to get students more interested in kind of technology, more interested in what they saw as subjects like chemistry, physics, because they thought those are the subjects that Russian people would need. And that was linked to an idea that Russia in the future would be involved in kind of war with other countries. They needed like a strong military and a strong state. I do hasten to add, in the interest of scholarly rigour, that is not something that is completely, it's not a unified idea in the groups. Like you can see kind of a discordant choir, and some believe that. There's a fragmented idea of kind of modernity and how to push things forward in a scientific and technical sense. It's just, for me, the examples are interesting because they're kind of outliers, really. It's not something that the central groups are really developing. So I think to answer your question, there isn't really a coherent answer, which I think is part of their problem, actually. I just don't think they're very good at that kind of the bigger picture vision for Russia's future. A lot of the symbolism of these groups, the ideas are quite archaic, as far as I can see it.
Got one question here, 5 hands. George, do you mind taking 2 or 3 at a time, or do you want one at a time?
I'll write them down, it's okay.
Okay, so there's one.
Basically, I wanted to ask the same question as this. Actually, it was about traditionalism versus modernity, and how you both need to get both these things in the extreme right. So I think that question's been answered already.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. The term Black Hundred refers to which of those groups, or all of them, or some of them, or
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was really, you said that after 1905 you got this kind of reaction to some of the kind of promises of progress and sort of like large-scale sort of liberal projects and the involvement of the masses in politics, and it was the reaction to that these groups started to grow. If they petered out in like 1908, 1909, why do you think it didn't happen in 1917? Why did you not get a similar phenomenon? Or you just haven't looked at that period?
Thank you for asking my Black Hundreds question. But the other question is, well, it's kind of similar to that as well. I mean, I look forward to your next book, which will focus on the Russian Revolution and the links between the radical right.
I'm moving in a different direction.
Yeah.
I'm leaving them alone. I've had enough. I've had enough of them.
You can't stop there. It's just getting interesting. Because we had the whole thing with Konilov, I don't know how to pronounce the damn name. Where obviously, in response to before the revolution, when you had the uprising during sort of the summer of 1917, you got these people who were clearly, certainly involved in military authoritarian solutions. They want the army to take over and bash people on the heads, certainly. And it seems inconceivable to me that the kind of groups we're talking about that the individuals involved in those groups weren't part of the Kornilov movement, or they weren't part of the whites. And so I'm kind of interested as to where these people didn't just fade away. They surely would have become more involved. But on the other hand, there doesn't seem, during the civil war between the whites and the reds, there doesn't seem to be a huge kind of ideological right-wing peasant thing. It's more to do with just the old regime against the peasants. There doesn't seem to be a kind of a popular fascist uprising, independent of the forces of autocracy and the army. So I'm kind of that's where I wish it would go. But you're not.
George, speaking to you. Sorry. Someone a question in the back?
Yeah. You mentioned the involvement of women. I
Yep.
wanted to know, were they assigned particular roles, or did they have any opportunities in politics to get involved in these kind of groups?
Can I take them in the order that I'm most comfortable giving good answers? Because I'm going to give a really rubbish answer to the 1917-21, so I simply don't know enough about it. To be honest, I just have not done the research in this period. It's just something that comes into my book right at the end, and the conclusion is kind of an afterword. I mean, I think one thing I should say practically is that some of the people involved in the movement in 1905 to 1907 do die, or other bad things happen to them. So they're not about to get involved. I mean, I think there are certainly more interesting reasons, I suspect, around society, politics, and socio-political development in Russia that probably mean the space for them in 1917 in February and October is denied. But in practical terms, there's simply not all of the people I've looked at were about at that point. Some of them, after their kind of scandals and the corruption, it kind of breaks apart the groups. They just retire from political life entirely, possibly just drained or fed up. Some of them do escape as well, like some of them leave. I know some of them go, I think Paris, quite a few of them go to after 1917. It was quite interesting. So I think John J. Stepan picks up in this book, like the Russian fascists, like Tragedy and Fast and Exile, where you see I think Nikolai Markov is mentioned in it. Certainly a few of the actors I look at, the big ones, kind of chronological, they're put down in his book. I would be not unsurprised if some of them are involved in things like the Kornilov affair. It wouldn't surprise me. Some of the foot soldiers, for example. But it's simply something I don't really know too much about. I know where some of them go, but I don't know. I can't account for all of them. I simply don't know the sources. But some of them are no longer about by 1917. So that puts an end to that. The other two questions I think I'll give slightly better answers to. The Black Hundreds one, I mean, it's a semantic kind of device, but it also does talk about real people. Certainly the Union of Russian People, the big group I talked about, in a lot of scholarship you'll just see them as kind of Black Hundreds. But in terms of when that term was being used, it was actually being adopted slightly before some of the groups I talked about even emerged. So I think just in terms of being specific and careful like we should be as historians, you can see that although there's an overlap between the large radical groups I looked at in late 1905, it's not simply like they're the same thing, right? Like Black Hundreds, I think, refers in practical terms to a wider social movement. People being involved, maybe, as Black Hundreds, who are actually not later involved in the radical right. That is not to deny there's some sort of overlap. And as shorthand, I think it absolutely makes sense to call them that. because I think we know what it means, right? It means a particular style of politics, but how close some of the connections are, I think it's tricky to tell, actually. I think the group that would be most associated with that term would be the Union of Russian People. I think the Russian Assembly, maybe not so much, I think, but certainly some of the large groups I looked at would be associated very closely with that term. So I hope that gives some kind of sense of kind of where I think it stands in terms of the use of the term, which I wholeheartedly support, incidentally. Although it can be quite problematic in terms of identifying who does what, where, at what time. The other thing about women, the other question, that's very interesting, and actually I wrote a little bit of a piece on this, because it's something I talked about in my book for 2 or 3 pages, and then I had a look at some newspapers from Finland Library and kind of wrote like a short article on it that might appear in a Russian journal in a year or two's time. And the role for women is very, very interesting because they are, in a sense, inclusive, some of these groups. Like you do see a very small number of women-only groups or groups mostly aimed at women appear, especially in the provincial areas of the Russian Empire, in which the radical right are active. However, of course, inclusion does not mean equality. These groups are not feminists, right? They have very prescribed roles for women, okay? Charity, what I mentioned earlier, they see female involvement in that as being something they'd like to push the female members towards. Women involved in the movement, but not often as leaders, more involved in the movement, but simply having a kind of what they saw as a social role within it, maybe taking notes, right? They're not interested in ideas of empowerment, but they want to include them as part of what they see as the group's social basis in Russian society, right? Quite interestingly, unlike some other contemporary right-wing groups in Europe from the time, they never have a constitution formally that excludes women at any stage. They're always open to the idea of recruitment, but it's something that I think gathers a bit more pace around about 1907, 1908 as the groups expand and diversify socially. And we certainly can point to examples of groups being involved that are exclusively for women, but the sort of activities they do are generally different from, as leaders saw it, the activities that male activists were assigned to. So certainly inclusion, but not an idea of equality and not an idea of empowerment.
Have you answered them all?
There was 1917, women and black hundreds I wrote down. Was there anything else? There were kind of 2 about 1917, weren't there? I don't know if it's 2 birds, 1 stone. Probably no stone neither.
So we've got 2 hands in there. Anyone else? Oh, okay. Right. We'll take these 4 here. So, Simon.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So one just quick question about Ukraine. You mentioned Kiev, Kharkov, and Odessa. For these Russian nationalists, were the Ukrainians the enemy? Just slightly better than the Jews, for example, or were they part of us, the Slavic nation? That's the first question. The second question, for me as a socialist today, one of the most nauseating phenomena I see is some people who think they're on the left sort of saying, well, you've got to understand this nationalism, it's the white working class, blah, 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 that's why people vote UKIP, we've got to be very careful, etc., etc. Did the socialists get thrown in that way? Did the socialists think, oh, there's a progressive kernel somewhere under these Black Hundred mobs, or did the socialists see this for what it was and go out and confront these people on the streets? How did the socialists react to these people?
You don't like politics as therapy.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions really, one short, one slightly more complex. The first is about going back to this discussion about what happened to these people, but not on the level of 1917. What I'm asking is, presumably, given lots of these people were relatively young, you've had pictures of students and whatever, presumably many of them ended up as officers in the Tsarist army during the First World War. And it would be interesting to know what role they played. And a question that I'm sure nobody can answer is how many of them got lynched by their troops during the development of the 1917 revolution. The second question is more about the mobilisation of the groups, and particularly the more radical ones. For example, you talked about their membership, including workers and peasants. Now I'm thinking in terms of peasantry. Are we talking about them being mobilised by landlords in a sort of clientelist formation? Mobilised in terms of, because their clients are they're holding land belonging to landlords who are in these organisations. But also ideologically, are we talking about these groups wanting to mobilise them with a vision of a sort of organic whole society where everybody knows their place? Are they trying to talk about mobilising them as if you like as shock troops, the lower classes as shock troops against the left? In the way, for example, that in India today, the formations of Hindutva, the BJP, the RSS, try and mobilise the Dalit classes and the lowest castes as shock troops to go out and kill Muslims and other groups of Dalits and whatever. So I'm wondering whether they are mobilising them as shock troops, whether they're simply clientelist, or whether there is also an element in terms of land reform. When they're talking about land reform, is this symbolic to include the peasantry so they would have some aspirations to be part of this movement, but really with no meaning to it? It's just a nice little pretty story. Or are they serious about it? And how would that affect the interests of the landlords?
George, I'm counting that as one question. There was two other hands that came up, I think. Yep.
How do you feel handling these more right-wing groups? Because obviously, I feel like you find them more favorable with the revolutionary voice. How would you handle them? How would you take care of them?
How did the Tsar handle them?
How did the Tsar handle these organisations? Is that right? How did the Tsar handle them? Thank you. Good question. And was there one last hand? Yes.
Right. I had two as well, but I think the internal organisation of the groups you'll cover at some point. I was going to ask about the role of art. Now, you already said that art can play a great role within these groups, also in terms of symbolism. But as an art historian, and as we can see at the moment in the Royal Academy show on the Russian Revolution, it did on the left play a very big role in terms of massing groups and forging a sense of connectivity between people. And particularly considering that Russian art history is full of political engagement right through from its emergence in the 1860s with the Wanderers, the Perevizhniki groups like that, through to very sort of historical painting throughout the 90s, which was designed essentially to be rabble rousing. Did they make use of that sort of Victor sense of Russian folk art movements in the 1860s to 90s?
Just a couple of issues for you to address.
Yeah, no, yes. It's going to be, so, Ukraine, okay, maybe I'll start that one. So, do they see Ukrainians as the enemy? I think the short answer is not usually. I think they saw them as part of the kind of the Russian kind of nation, and I think that kind of distinction of kind of Russian by ethnicity, Russian by nationality, I think they make that ethnicity distinction quite a lot, groups like the Union of Russian People, but they don't seem to do it too much for the case of Ukrainians. In sources that I've come across, they generally don't do that too much. And I think there's a very good book on this recently, Faith Hillis, or Children of Rus, and I think she came to the same conclusion that the radical nationalists she looked at, some of which were the same people I came across, they didn't really see that kind of distinction there, they didn't really kind of believe in that. So could they see the kind of Ukrainian people as the enemy? Not really. I mean, certain parts of the Russian Empire, certainly like Poles, certain parts of it, they were very anti, but not, in my opinion at least, from what I've seen, maybe not so much. Okay, so I find that one quite straightforward. Kind of, or a difficult question. Conceptually hard, but I think there's an answer from the sources I've looked at. How did the socialists react? Yeah, that's an interesting one too. I think that the radical left kind of helped mobilise the right. Like the periods I've looked at across the empire, generally speaking, not always, but generally, the right appear where there's quite like a strong revolutionary tradition. So like Odessa would be an example that I looked at a fair bit, like this kind of activism in there for some years, right? And the revolutionary left, I think, in a way, are one of those contextual developments that the right kind of needs, because they kind of seek to oppose it quite strongly. So how do the revolutionaries react, considering we know that revolutionaries are often present with them? Well, certainly in certain parts of the empire, you can see like violence between So like Odessa, like some of the files looked at in the Russian State Archive, do talk quite a lot about this kind of clash between revolutionaries and the kind of Black Hundreds, the radical right, and that's something that I think informs that kind of idea of like kind of the lawless period following 1905 revolution. So certainly for some of the groups that I've looked at, you know that they're involved in clashes with the far left. I mean, and I know this might not map on clearly to the question you say, but I also know there's an issue as well of kind of Jewish self-defence that's been explored in some of these groups and movements. And I hope I pronounced his name correctly. It's the German historian Stefan Wieser, W-I-E-S-E, recently wrote a book on collective violence in the late Russian Empire and like the emotive experience of collective violence. And he had a very good case study of Zhytomyr, and it seemed to be that this kind of Jewish self-defence and radical right kind of intertwined, not always in terms of actual violence between the movements, but an idea of violence, like that kind of raised political temperatures and made violence from those who maybe weren't even clearly connected to the groups more likely, simply because there's an idea of what the groups kind of meant in the space, if that makes sense. Mm. But that's something that I found very interesting actually in the research, yeah. So I think I can give an idea of how the socialists kind of react. The question about what happens to the students as well, that's a really good one. I mean, I'm not really sure from the sources I've looked at. I'm also not convinced the Tsar himself, even given their ostensible support for him, would want them. Because by the period that we're looking at, the period I looked at, I think some of the groups have been kind of discredited in the eyes of the state. So even if the Tsar himself had quite a favourable attitude, it could be that his lieutenants and subordinates surrounding him would be potentially quite concerned by people from these radical right-wing movements coming into kind of the army and potentially being a source of maybe destabilisation, like possibly in a broader sense conflict. That is slightly speculation. I don't know that based on sources, but that would be my inclination based on what I know about the groups. But the question of where do students go is a good one, and I wish I could say a little bit more about it. I'm just not convinced the Tsar himself would maybe be allowed to have them in the ranks at that time, or would maybe even kind of want them. The question about mobilisation of peasantry is a very interesting one. I haven't really come across too many references in the literature to the idea of kind of shock troops. So I think probably, as you say, that the former approach, more clientelist, is probably correct. Their aspirations for the peasantry, as I said earlier, kind of alluded to in the section about ideology, they're not particularly novel. So the idea of kind of the peasant commune, for example, like we need to keep it because it's like the good social unit of Russian society, that was still kind of there, right? So presumably the peasantry would still be there to be part of the commune. So how much are actually kind of empowering the peasantry to kind of rise up and form some sort of other part of society, kind of changing their social role? I'm not sure they had a radical idea in many respects to actually kind of transform that, maybe. That comes out more in the debate about the land question, kind of giving the peasantry more land, which isn't self-vexatious because traditionally conservative support was based upon the gentry. And of course that makes them in a way not conservative. You know, that's why a lot of traditional conservative groups don't like these people. You know, ideologically they're enemies. So I know that's not like a brilliant answer to your question about the peasantry, but I don't see a lot of innovation in terms of reimagining the peasant role in the sources that I look at. If anything, it's looking backwards towards the commune, towards an early idea of what the peasantry meant for Russia. Okay. There was another one, wasn't there? How did the Tsar handle them as well? What did the Tsar do? Well, I know that he met them. I know that he writes in his diary and elsewhere in like 1905, 1906 that he sees them as kind of like good citizens, like good subjects of Russia that he can rely upon in the coming storm to come. And I think that's partly when that storm passes, that revolution passes, I know less about the Tsar's relationship with these people. I know that even as late as 1910, 1911, he was welcoming delegations of them. But whether too much thought was coming from his kind of inner office towards the right-wing movement, that's just something I'm not particularly certain about. And that's why it's good questions, I can't answer it properly. But now, how did the Tsar handle them? I know he personally was quite keen, and I don't see evidence that appreciative response dissipated what actually happened to them, I'm less certain about. The question about art was very interesting. I mean, their ideas of art they talk about in their like seminars, in their meetings, are quite backwards looking. I mean, they're kind of evenings of kind of, I guess, sort of high culture but bad taste, I suppose. I think Mikhail Glinka, Life of the Tsar, like the opera, that's one of their favourite things to talk about. And also the Russian kind of classics as well, are kind of talked about sometimes. The folk cultural tradition, like the Slavophiles really interested, like Kirievsky, I find that very fascinating. I don't know if there's too much of that though in these groups. I think there's quite restrictive in terms of who they talked about. They certainly talk about the canon a bit, like I've come across references to Lermontov, Pushkin, not so much Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, maybe. Interestingly. Dostoevsky maybe too subversive, perhaps, maybe, despite this ideological kind of, maybe some degree of kind of accordance. But yeah, the status of folk art, quite an interesting question, but not something that I see developed kind of beyond quite a rudimentary sense of kind of the art of the people, for example. And I haven't seen any references at all in their literature to the Wanderers movement. I just haven't, not saying they're not there, I just haven't seen them. But thank you for the question, another very interesting one as well.
Okay, can I get a sense of who would like to ask a question? There's 1 here, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so start down here.
Yes, in any revolution, the question of sensing it in advance is an important question. Now, it has been said that as early as the last quarter of 1916, that the organization of local government bodies had written to the Tsar saying that revolution was on its way. And Solzhenitsyn, in his, I think, Red Wheel, records this document. He reproduces it. Now, did any of these radical right groups sense that 1917, that is February and October, was on its way?
So you look at the social composition of the Union Archbishop, people as intellectuals, and workers and students, and some members of the clergy. Obviously, quite a major constituency for right-wing support today is the police. Are there any instances of the police being attracted to these organisations, or were they, in general, too loyal to the Tsarist regime?
My question was that you said that, in terms of answering Massey's question, you said that the Tsar said in his diary that he would have counted on them. So what I was wondering is why he would have done that. Because from what I know, the Tsar seemed like the type of person that he wants people to follow his kind of ideologies, and someone who didn't follow his ideology would seem immediately as a threat. As a movement that's so like radically right and is not exactly on the same wavelength as the Tsar, I would think that he wouldn't have trusted them or even like thought that he could counter them. So that's like basically what I wanted to know.
Is it one at the back as well?
I just wanted to make a point about the mobilisation that you were talking about. I was really interested to hear about the parallels and similarities to modern politics that we have. You were talking about crisis and how picking on minority groups, socialists and Jewish people, was such a major point in kind of the mobilisation of other larger groups. And obviously with the Eurogov triad as well, the deep hostilities with the enemy, land expropriation, the things such as like true people. In comparison to like the politics of UKIP and the politics in the Middle East, for example, I am concerned at issues like this. We haven't learned from our history. My question is, are you just as concerned as I am, whether or not we've actually learned from the past?
One more, yeah, go for it.
It's just a very general question, which I think you'll probably touch on when you round up at the end. It's really how effective were these groups, or were they effective in terms of maybe blocking the progress of the revolution for a while, being a drag on the revolutionary process in those key years, especially in around 1905, 1910.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I think the first one that came at me in the second round, was it third round maybe? The third round of questions was the question about sensing the revolution and foresight. Very interesting question, I think, yeah, fascinating. I mean, certainly isolated examples within the movement, some of the more, I think, perceptive observers within it. I think there was a sense of this. So one of them that I haven't mentioned at all in my talk today was Lev Tikhomirov. who was previously involved in the 19th century in radical left movements and eventually migrated across the political spectrum to become very sympathetic to the far right. And he talked in his diary about kind of like the coming revolution and like the coming apocalypse. If you look kind of back to it, he had quite a far degree, I think, of foresight of the cataclysm that was to come. You know, he saw Russia as in the throes of chaos and despair, and even after 1905, 1906, he just thought something similar might happen again. So you can see from certain individuals, I think, some foresight. Another interesting thing to think about linked to that, I know you're not quite on point in what you were saying, but it's the idea of kind of like looking back. Like one of the figures that I mentioned earlier, Nikolai Markov, he wrote some jottings in the 1920s about the kind of history of the movement, and he talked about kind of the inability of the Tsar to kind of see what he did, and he said the Tsar should have realised, like, and he mentioned Mussolini in the context of 1920s fascism. He said the Tsar should have realised we were potentially a really strong basis of social reform, a buttress of his ideas, right? And if he had picked up on that, then maybe the movement would have been better served by the autocracy, and actually revolution could have been averted. So, okay, completely retrospective idea with the benefit of hindsight. It's quite interesting that he kind of saw that parallel between what's going on in Europe in the 1920s and kind of chose to write about it in his writings. To answer your question more directly, you certainly can see that within the movement there are certainly a few individuals who see the revolution with some foresight. Not a radical rightist, but Nikolai Dernovo wrote something called the Dernovo Memorandum, you might have come across, and about the coming war between the European powers, and he talks about how Russia should ally with Germany because they've got kind of fundamentally quite similar aims, and that is to be kind of very wary of Britain and France, like the opposite of what they did. And the level of foresight in that document is quite incredible in terms of the social crisis that is to come. He was not a radical rightist, he was conservative from within the autocracy. If you want to see kind of foresight, that's a good one to look at. A Russian book out on him came recently, subtitled The Russian Nostradamus. This gives you an idea of some of how some Russian historians interpret him nowadays. Okay, so we'll move on now to the police and the rights. I mean, I should say, I don't know off the top of my head of any instances of police actually themselves becoming involved in the movement. You know, like the Zygotov episode from earlier. I can't really think of any similar parallel. I do know that generally speaking, the police on the ground seem to be quite suspicious because of their potential for disorder. However, I think looking at archival records, we can see instances in which the police were very slow to respond to what they did. I think the reasons for that can be very complicated. I don't necessarily think it's because the police are sympathetic to them. The Russian police, generally speaking, was quite undermanned, and it wasn't a particularly effective organisation at this time. And I think foot dragging and a weak response to radical rightists were probably to do with quite boring things actually, like personnel, rather than kind of ideological parallels. It's a point that scholars like Jonathan Daly and Ian Laupkin talk about in much more detail, like the weakness of the Russian police and the idea of kind of Russia being undergoverned in that sense. To answer your question, I just don't know too much about whether police were actually in the movement. I haven't come across many accounts of it, so I suspect if it was happening, it probably wasn't a very mainstream thing going on. The Tsar and the rights, I mean, certainly the Tsar writes about them in quite a positive sense initially. However, I think we've got to remember that Nicholas II, his understanding of modern politics was not very good. So I think it might have been a thing on his part where he took the right kind of at face value, kind of looked at the symbols, looked at the ideas, and said like, oh, like, you know, they're saying the same as what I believe, you know, they're good, you know, without really understanding actually how the movement worked. And I think those who are kind of closer to the action, as it were, at the grassroots, but within the autocracy, are suspicious because they probably have contact with these people. Nicholas II is a bit further removed, which I think can, in part, explain his response. There's certainly a degree of ideological concordance, but as I said earlier, believing in Uvayev doctrine does not preclude different interpretations of those same principles. So yeah, there's certainly a parallel there, and I think that's a good question. You're certainly right to see a kind of a link. But I think Nicholas II possibly made a mistake in terms of thinking the ideology and the kind of the badges were all it was to them, rather than thinking more widely about how the movement operated. I think the comparison to the radical right today, I mean, yeah, we're always in danger of kind of not learning lessons of history, but we need to remember history doesn't repeat itself, really. It always, things, you know, democracies die in different ways at different times, don't they? So it's kind of, I think we've got to think about, if there are lessons to be learned, it's not a question of kind of like cycles, it's also a question of kind of looking at the context, looking at the time and thinking what can we take from the period. I mean, if we're going to talk about the radical right now, right, and if we say UKIP for taxonomical purposes are radical right, I think we're quite lucky in the sense that they are going to die. The support, the reasons that gave rise to them, worryingly, will still be there. So something might replace them. But the actual party itself, and I think you mentioned UKIP, its raison d'etre for existing has gone. Kind of the EU thing is kind of its raison d'etre doesn't, I think, support it so strongly as it maybe did several months ago. And the other thing about UKIP is, like the radical right I looked at, it's chaotic. Like, it's full of like people who are just not very good at politics. Like, you know, once the Farage cult was removed, like, we got Squire Nuttall and his sort of fake doctorate, and it didn't go down very well, did it, in the Stoke by-election? So, I mean, in terms of that particular movement and group, I have maybe, hopefully won't be proven wrong, but I have some degree of optimism about what's going to happen to them. But I'm concerned about the wider social context. I am concerned of what's going to come to follow, and I'm very concerned more widely about the fallout of kind of the Brexit climate as well, which might kind of give similar movements kind of succour in the future. So I think, to answer your question directly, absolutely right. We need to be concerned. You know, we need to think seriously about history. And I hate to say it, I love to quote this story about remembering a name, and I hate doing that. But something I saw on Twitter a few days ago, think of history not so much as kind of lessons from history, but more kind of the midwife of the present. I think that's kind of a quite effective way of thinking about how we study the past and how we apply lessons from the past to present and future things to come. The final question, I think it was, wasn't it? Were they effective in blocking the progress of the revolution? I think the autocracy probably managed to put down 1905, 1906 kind of by itself. I think the right probably, if anything, made its job harder, because it's another potential focus point for dissent, especially in a very large empire in which the metropole is really proportionally quite a small thing, really. Like keeping tabs on disorder throughout the Russian Empire would have been very, very difficult, and the idea of kind of regional radical right-wing groups popping up probably would have made the autocracy's job harder rather than easier. I'm not saying they somehow made the revolution more likely or better, I just think they probably made that job of autocratic restoration and authority restoration they purport to support maybe harder rather than easier. I know it's kind of paradoxical, but I think that's just what I've come across from the sources. I hope that kind of answers your question in some sense.
Your energy level.
Yeah, totally. I mean, more questions. I love questions to make me realise how little I know.
Okay, we've got one here. We've got a second one in the back. Third one here. Maybe squeeze one more in. Anyone got a question? 4. Okay, great. So the first one was.
Yeah. Was there any sort of evidence that the right movements in Russia were looking at the question of modernisation, of industry, of technological change within the agrarian sector, this sort of thing? And how did this fit in with their ideas of maintaining the autocracy? Did they realise there was a contradiction between modernisation and an archaic political form?
Are you Paul Flewers?
Yeah.
Yes, I met you before at UCL about 2.5 years ago.
Am I not asking the same question?
Hello, no.
I know there's 2 up there. There was one more.
Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry, I was about that. My question was that in terms of this kind of like new movement, like radical right movement, I was wondering if it would have prompted the movement of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and like prompted them to kind of like create their own revolution and overthrow, like, but obviously they overthrow the Tsar, but kind of like prompt them to go against the Tsar and the state that he's created.
The radical right in general, I think, it's a period of uncertainty, as you outlined early on. But people who are worried, looking for somebody to blame, and preferably somebody to hit hard, not upwards, not against the Tsar, not against the state, but killing a few Jews, winding up socialists. It's like, Cable Street, the EDF marching in Muslim areas and the rest of it. Is there a lot of that sort of activity from when the groups are fairly large?
Yeah, my question, I think, ties in with some of the things that have already been covered, but I was wondering if there was evidence of that the previous leftist movements of going back to the people, the populist movements, is there evidence of a crossover from that form of populism to the right populism or the Slavophiles? Because if you're talking about the people, then what happens? You don't necessarily become a nationalist. Is there evidence that there was a crossover?
Okay, so the first question about kind of modernisation in the agrarian sector and the kind of development of industry. Much like, I've kind of said this already a few times, it'll probably bore you, but it kind of depends what group you're looking at. So some of the groups have quite a restrictive view of kind of agricultural kind of development. They believe in kind of like very kind of traditional, if you're allowed to use that term, views of kind of what the Russian peasantry is going to do, and they don't really kind of develop any ideas of kind of modernisation. It's not something all of the groups think, especially after 1905. If you come back slightly kind of forward in time, some of the groups have a slightly different view of how Russian industry is going to work. I think, kind of as I've alluded to in different parts of the talk, I think the idea of this kind of ideological kind of fragmentation amongst the groups, having different responses to what they see as the problems in Russia, is probably one of the reasons why the movement's kind of somewhat incoherent, it doesn't work more effectively, so pulling in different directions. And I think agriculture is part of that. I don't think there's really a kind of a unified response amongst the right to how it works. And I also think some of them don't see the contradiction. As you say, I don't think all of them really understand that there's a problem there, conceptually, right? I think that some of the groups I looked at small scale are interested in pushing through kind of ideas of technology and development in industry, but I don't think that's like a mainstream idea. It's not something I saw in the Union of Russian People too much, for example, the biggest group. It's more of a splinter group thing, okay? But I think to answer your question, I don't think they maybe always see that kind of contradiction, or if they do see it, they don't see it very clearly. I think the question about how they prompt the revolutionary left is really interesting, because actually, although the radical right don't talk that much, they do stuff to them, don't talk that much about the revolutionary left, more about liberalism, I think, immediately after 1905. The revolutionary left do talk about them. Now, this is something I haven't explored too much, but my new project isn't on the radical right, it's on martyrdom, late Imperial Russia, which the revolutionary left are really interested in as a kind of concept. And some of the earlier papers looked at, like the very early Bolshevik press, like Forward, coming out like 1904, 1905, and some of the other ones, Proletariat following, they certainly do talk about like the Black Hundreds quite a lot in their press. So I don't think it's at all a stretch to say that they're kind of pushing forward an idea of kind of revolution in a sense. Kind of they're initiating maybe a tougher response from the revolutionary left than might otherwise have been the case. They're certainly influencing their discourse at some level. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that. It's something that, again, as with several of the questions today, I just haven't done the spade work yet, so I don't know enough about it to say how widespread it is. All I know is I can see evidence of that occurring. Drawing parallels, I think, between, say, 1920s activism, 30s activism, what the Union of Russian People did. You certainly see that to some extent. Like, I know from looking at archival documents and other things as well, that the radical right were involved in some violence, but that applies not to all of the groups. So Russian Assembly, I haven't found too many instances. And in fact, I found evidence that some of the right-wing groups don't like being lumped in a group like the Union of Russian People, because they think it discredits them. They don't like being called like violent kind of radical rightists, so I think it takes away from their credibility. But certainly some individual activists within the Union of Russian People become involved in violent acts. There's a very good article by Ian Lauklen on the Union of Russian People's botched attempt to assassinate Sergei Vitin, for example. So it's not just a question of sort of street violence at a more in-car level, also targeted assassination is something that certain members of the right do become involved in. And if you want to follow it up in more detail, I suggest maybe having a look at his article. It's called The Accidental Terrorist. They tried to put a bomb down the chimney, it didn't blow up. They're pretty inept. Like, they're not, unlike the socialist revolutionaries, they're not very good at killing people. Not in that targeted sense, anyway. In terms of street violence, there's certainly more evidence that that was more of a widespread phenomenon. There was a question, wasn't there, about the crossover between 1870s populism and the later rights, yeah. And that's very interesting, I think. I mean, I started out doing my PhD, not on the radical right at all. I started doing it on kind of the link between kind of populism and conservatism in the late 19th century, because I did think there was a crossover, and you certainly see an idea of kind of this, kind of the idea of kind of the, I suppose for want of a better term, like the myth of the Russian peasantry, being present in the 1870s, kind of going to the people movement, and then later on in terms of the right-wing idea too. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say you can see elements of that idea crossing over across decades. However, I do find it in the right discourse they don't really talk too much about going to the people or kind of populism of that 1870s era, because I think in many respects it's probably quite problematic for them to talk about that. Although they might have similarities in terms of some of the ideas, the eventual intentions and aims of the movement are quite different, I think, in many respects. So, although there is a crossover ideologically, in like a practical sense, I think we've got to be quite careful to delineate between the two phenomena. But yeah, you certainly can see an idea of kind of populism more broadly within the radical right, I think. Like an idea of populism maybe even as we would understand it now, perhaps. Although, again, like a lot of the terms I've been throwing around in a very cavalier way, it's a very, very thorny term, and a difficult one to unpack.
Just to add to this, one moment of crossover, of course, is the question of anti-Semitism, which is quite significant in the populist movement in the 1870s, and that provokes a really quite an intense debate on the socialist left. And social democracy, one of the things it does is to break from that tradition, or to at least attempt to break from that tradition. But yeah, we can maybe talk about that later. Can you go another round? Or
I don't know. How many more questions are there? Like, a lot of people want to ask questions. You've got so many. It's like a fireside chat.
Okay, we've got one more question there. Is there another comment, question, or contribution that someone feels they would like to make, especially someone that's not spoken yet? Yep. And will that be the final word, or is there? Okay. Do two more to go.
Okay.
Okay. So.
Okay, so my final question is that I just wanted to know whether the radical right wanted to overthrow the Tsar in the way that the Bolsheviks wanted to kind of overthrow the Tsar and gain power. And if so, to what extent did they use terror to kind of grow their movement and gain power?
Is there much of a sort of popular memory of these groups today in Russia today? Does Vladimir Putin or anyone in Russia sort of evoke their memory to sort of rally support?
Yeah, they're good questions, aren't they? And I was really keen actually for someone to ask a contemporary one, because I thought that always happens to a talk of this nature. I thought, when's it coming? We got in there right at the end. Okay, the first question I think I can give quite a kind of succinct answer to. The radical right aren't really interested in overthrow of the Tsar in a kind of institutional sense. They want an autocracy, so they don't want to get rid of it like the Tsar as the figurehead. They don't want to do that. It's not part of their plan. However, that doesn't mean there's not criticism of Nicholas II as an individual. Nicholas II, by say 1914, 1917, right, earlier than that, he was not widely toasted in conservative circles, right? In the radical right groups that I looked at, the idea that he's kind of a weak leader, or like a weak Tsar, is quite widespread. Like there's some personal criticism of him is emerging. There's a really good article by Sergei Pavlotov on this, like right-wing critique of Nicholas II, and he kind of pinpoints kind of where it all comes from, like, in terms of discourse. And you have an idea by reading that article, it's actually quite widespread, right? Especially an idea of kind of his personal weaknesses as Tsar. But that's not a critique of the institution of autocracy, that's a critique of his personality. It's important to make that distinction. Okay, but I didn't like seek an overthrow of autocracy in itself. The one about memory today is really interesting. I mean, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, dissolution in 91, you see like a sort of a renaissance of kind of right-wing newspapers, some of which I've seen in libraries in Russia. They often bear the same badges and groups, names, right, in the early 90s. So you've got one of the main radical right newspapers, the Union of Russian People newspapers, called Russkoye Znamya, so like Russian Banner, and there is like a newspaper called Russian Banner that mentions this group, it talks about them, obviously, different personnel, but you can see, I'm not that bad historian, different personnel, but you can see that there's kind of semantically like a throwback, right? And you see that with a few papers, it's not just one, there's like a handful, like certainly a number of them are doing that kind of that revivalist idea. None of them are long lasting, they die out. But if you're looking at more widely, do people talk about themselves in this kind of idea of like kind of like radical kind of far right, then I think you do see it. It's kind of on the fringes. I don't think it's something the state itself is doing too much. That's not to say the state is not adopting radical nationalist badges. I think it is in certain respects, but I think it's doing it in a different way, and I haven't seen them publicly give any kind of green light to these groups. I know that the ideological and educational projects of contemporary Russia, they've started to talk more about kind of Tsarism, so like the 1917 revolution, like we're really excited about it. Like in Russia itself, like it's not actually as big an event from what I can gather from reading their press as it might be, you think. Like they are talking about it, but it's not something that's being pushed that hard by the state, not compared to something like May Day, for example, or the military parade, right? That's kind of has to me seems to have like a higher role in Russia, right? However, I'm not to say the state aren't interested in these ideas, but I haven't seen much of a clear link, really, in terms of whether they're talking about these groups. I find more on the fringes of society, the fringes of politics. You can see some talk about them. You can see some see themselves as kind of like the inheritors. But how many groups appear? How many groups exist now? I should say, sorry, that style themselves in this image. I don't know. But I've certainly seen evidence over the past 20, 25 years of different forms of media that are alluding to them. Yeah.
Okay, that was a really comprehensive talk and even more comprehensive set of responses to really challenging questions. And we are going to thank you in a minute, George. Just before we do that, I just have a few announcements. First thing, our next talk